Hey everybody, how's it going? Glad you're with us. We got so much stuff coming up with Easter and all that kind of stuff coming on. Man, I know that you're probably thinking about, if you're thinking about Easter like we are, there's probably a lot of, well, let me be clear. Nobody's thinking about Easter like we are, but I know that you're probably making some plans and you're thinking about some people you might be wanting to invite. Again, so many different services, so many ways to do that. If you're going to the Swanner House, again, RSVP, let us know that you're coming. If you're coming here with us, of course, bring a friend, serve if you want, all that kind of stuff. Great stuff happening at Easter. But by the way, you might be a person who's invited today. You might be wondering kind of what's going on, who we are, all of that stuff. Let me just kind of put you at ease a little bit, try to get you to relax a little. My name's Jeff, one of the pastors here. And man, I just know that coming to a new church or coming to an experience like this, or even investigating some stuff, always there's a lot of sort of baggage that goes with that. So let me just tell you, this is not a room full of people or a place where everybody's got everything figured out. This is not the place for people who know all the answers. It's for people who are in progress or in process. So like we say this all the time, we're a work in progress kind of group of people, and we're doing our best as we know how, to aim our lives at Jesus and to do that together. Because the best thing about our church is the people of the church. In fact, that's the technical definition of church. So however you came into today, just know you're with people, at Harbor Point who are trying to figure it out too. And we're glad you're with us. Hopefully we can get you more connected, and you can call this place home at some point when you want to. Now, a whole lot to get through today in a pretty comfortable, like I would say, just buckle your seatbelts, kind of uncomfortable. I'll do my best to walk us through it, but we're not afraid of some things that are uncomfortable. That's where we tend to grow the most anyways, but let's get right to it. We had a staff event for some of us last year, and the activity was, I guess it's sort of a viral activity, but we did it with our staff. Each person got paired up with someone else, and we had to paint a portrait of the person directly across from us, and they didn't get to see it at all, but we painted a portrait. So all of us, I'll give you the wide shot here, all of us got a chance to do this, to paint a picture of the person across from us. And so I'll give you a couple examples of, now, I should say this way, there is not a huge sort of contingent of people on our staff who are amazing at painting portraits, except for these right here. So here you go. I'll just give you a couple. There's some real future masterpieces here. This is all just from that same exact shot you just saw. So there I was. And this is how I got represented by someone on our staff. And I just want to say I really appreciate the jawline. I mean, very, very square jawline. Obviously very masculine there. It's impressive. I love that. Here's Adam's. Adam is our life groups guy. So he's our group's pastor. Here was I thought, that's so sweet. That's a really cute version of Adam. I mean, everything's pretty much on point there. Here's Sydney, who she works with our emerging leaders. She's a pastor of our emerging leaders. And here's Adam's portrait of her. So I mean, it's uncanny, the resemblance. And our executive pastor Trisha Graves, who's really behind so much of what you see happen, what you see happening here. She's behind a lot of it. And so she's, here's our executive pastor, and here's how she's represented. Just such a flattering version of herself. And I don't know if that person actually still works on our staff anymore. Funny. Anyways, but the task is this, to actually do our best to recreate the original image on on this painting, to do whatever we can to recreate. We're looking at the image, and the instruction was, do the best that you can to make the most accurate representation of the person that you're sitting across from. Now, you got all that stuff. You get the idea. What's actually happening here, though, is there's a huge contrast between what all of us intended as amateur artists who have never done it before and what actually is. Big contrast between what's intended and what actually is. Now, we're in the 5th week of a series called Uncommon Sense. And often in Jesus' teaching and ministry, we'll circle back to this, what is intended and what is in a second. But what's often we see in Jesus' teaching and ministry is he'll say things like, he'll actually say something like, you've heard it said, but I say. Like, in other words, there's a prevailing wisdom about the way you should think about some things. I get how you might understand that, but I'm going to challenge every one of those things. And whenever he does that kind of statement, which he says that frequently, it's that the Bible records the disciples often hearing him say that, along with other people going, they just did not understand. He's saying something that contradicts the prevailing wisdom, and people generally don't understand. And there's lots of responses when people don't understand stuff. But Jesus was going against, he wasn't meeting people's expectations. He was somehow or another violating their own idea of how he was supposed to be. And he doesn't give everybody always an explanation. And the disciples who asked this question, they did not, this response to Jesus, they have this response, they did not understand. Those disciples actually They're a lot like us because they want to understand everything, and not everything that do they understand. And the Bible actually gives us a kind of an idea that that's actually something that it's not really promised to us, that we'll understand everything. In every single week of the series, we've been hitting this same exact verse because it does reset the idea that we're not owed an explanation and that God isn't going to always give it to us. It says this in Isaiah 55. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, and neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. Even if, the Bible will say, even if I could give you an explanation for everything that's happening, God would say, you still wouldn't be able to understand it. It's just my ways are so much higher than yours. You just won't get it. So much of what God's doing in the Bible and so much of what Jesus is doing in his ministry is frustrating a lot of people because they don't understand. It doesn't make any sense. Now, today, we're going to talk about something. One of the most common traits that religious people share in common is that they all have an image of their God, whatever again, I'm talking about any religious sort of tradition that has a God. Everybody has an image of what that God is like. Now, even most people who would say, like I'm not sure about any kind of religious or tradition, that might be you. Look, you have some imagination or some picture of what God is like most of the time. One famous scholar, he had this story about where he was at Oxford, and he'd go around meeting all these new students. And one of the things that he would say, as you maybe heard me say this before too, is he would say, hey, I'm a pastor here, and if you want to talk to anybody, and sometimes the student would say, well, I don't believe in God. And he would say, well, tell me about the God you don't believe in. And the person would give some explanation. He would say, well, I don't believe in that God either. And then they would start their own conversation. The point is, everybody, even someone who's not sure about, any kind of idea of God, at least has some image of what that looks like. But religious people in particular, they also will have an idea about what the do's and don'ts are of what that God is. Whatever that image of that God is, whatever that sort of picture of who that person is like, they'll also sort of from that draw an idea about what are the do's and don'ts, what do we do in relationship to this God, what is that God requiring us? Now, part of the criticism of Jesus by the religious leaders of his particular time was that their criticism was that he wasn't really taking the Hebrew Bible seriously. Like, he got it wrong. He kept somehow missing out on the right stuff. He was actually violating or not doing what they anticipated should be done. What's fascinating, though, is Jesus' response over and over again, which actually will fly in the face of a lot of our own understanding about Jesus. Because Jesus' response wasn't to these leaders, was like, hey, you guys are actually like, maybe you're like a little too intense. You got to dial down some of the intensity with the Hebrew Bible. He actually doesn't say, religious leaders, you should take the Bible less seriously. It's not what he says. Over and over again, his answer to these folks isn't just, hey, you guys should really just calm down a bit, which is kind of what we think he would be saying. Instead, Jesus says to these religious leaders who are called Pharisees, we'll talk about them in a moment, but he'll say, look, religious leaders, Pharisees, you're not taking the Bible seriously enough. Because what he's saying is, if you're trying to get at the heart of what God is intending for his people, elevating the Bible is what you ought to be doing, not lowering it, not actually reducing it and watering it. In fact, if you find a way to bring it down, you're actually managing to compromise what you intend to make the most important thing. So he says, look, if you would want to figure out what the heart of the Bible is all about, you want to figure out what the heart of God is, don't minimize the Bible, actually elevate it. So Jesus will kind of, in effect, is what he's telling these religious leaders, he's like, you don't seem to, he provokes this all the time. You guys, religious leaders, you don't seem to see the difference between righteousness and self-righteousness. In your minds, Pharisees, or at least this group of Pharisees, you've kind of linked these two things together. And when Jesus does this, they look at him with anger, but they look at him because he's not making any sense. You're saying, Jesus, that what we're doing, while we're doing everything right, we're still somehow missing something. And he's like, that's everything right there. Whatever that is that you just described, that's everything. And they don't get it all the time. So because of that, they're constantly trying to trip him up, which brings us to today. Mark chapter 10, verse 1 says this. Jesus then left that place and went into the region of Judea across the Jordan River. Again, crowds of people came to him, and as was his custom, he taught them. So there's a big crowd of people. Bible, particularly the Gospel of Mark, doesn't describe Jesus as wanting the crowd for the crowd's sake, just that they came to him. And as was his custom, which he always did, he taught these folks. And it says then that some Pharisees, not all the Pharisees, but some Pharisees came and tested him. Okay, let's talk about a few things. First of all, Pharisees are not priests. They're not part of the priestly ruling class. These are lay people, meaning they're not officially part of the temple, in terms of like who runs the temple stuff. But their belief, and again, this is a really condensed version, their belief is that their own moral rightness and the moral rightness of the people who belong to God, the Jewish folks, that if they could get that right, that would be the key to God sort of seeing their faithfulness and his coming to their rescue and elevating them. And again, sort of dealing with all whatever Rome is, the oppression of Rome, all of that stuff. The word Pharisee is actually derived from a word perushim, which actually means the separated ones. These guys believed themselves that the most important thing they could do was to separate themselves. And their frustration with Jesus a lot has to do with the fact that he's constantly associating what they would categorize as notorious sinners. Because he continued like eating dinner with them and inviting them to hang out. And all these folks continue to associate with Jesus. And they would say about Jesus that he's actually undermining the project that they're working on, which is to bring about a very holy nation. Now, the word test, by the way, as it says, some Pharisees came and tested him. The word test isn't like, we just want to see how well you know your Hebrew scriptures. The word actually has built into it is that there's an intention to trap him with a particular thing, to get him in a no-win situation so that they can stir up some controversy. So, once again, verse 2, to continue on. Some Pharisees came and tested him and asked him this question: is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Now, okay, so last week, if you're with us, I got to talk about hell, which was so fun. And then today, Jesus is asked about divorce. And I have to tell you, just honestly, it's just the next passage. It wasn't like I thought this is a great weekend to talk about this. It just was the next passage in line. And the upside of that is this: confronting the tough passages in the Bible is actually how we get shaped. I mean, if I never confronted those things, actually, as we read the Bible, then there would be no, I should say this way, confronting tough passages is how the Bible shapes me, and not the other way around. If I only find the comfortable things, I'm looking for ways to sort of dodge some of this stuff. And we do have to lean into some stuff. So we're going to talk about it, but I just want to tell you, I'm not apologizing for it, just getting you ready for it. So if you're single, you're married, you're engaged, you're separated, you're divorced, however you might come into this, I'm married and I've been married for, almost 27 years. And I was raised by a single mom. I got sensitivity across the board for all kinds of stuff in this particular area. But I do want to tell you, at the heart of this passage is actually something really, really beautiful about the heart of God. And it's about Jesus in the most incredible way. So stay with me, lean in. It's going to be great, okay? But we're going to have to go through some tough stuff to get there. Here we go. Once again, Mark chapter 10, verse 2. The Pharisees came and tested him by asking, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Jesus, to give you this too, there's this no-win conversation here. It's a no-win conversation and a test, as it were, for two reasons. One, there's a cultural backdrop, and it is as intense as any kind of tabloid scenario you'd read anywhere. Here's the story. It's kind of fascinating. So this one guy, he's called the Tetrarch, which means a ruler of the fourth. The Roman authority has granted this particular person a ruler. He's been given, his name's Herod Antipas, the ability to rule over a particular area of what's called the Galilee. He's married. That marriage is a political union with another king, kind of. So they're organizing some sort of stuff there. It's a political association. But Herod Antipas, he really digs his brother-in-law's wife. He does his brother-in-law's wife. So he's real pumped about her. He thinks she's great, whatever. He divorces his own wife, thus dissolving and creating all kinds of controversy with the political union. And he remarries his brother-in-law's wife. And meanwhile, a guy, maybe you've heard of him, a guy named John the Baptist or John the Baptizer, he confronts Herod and tells him, look, this is not okay. And then Herod has him beheaded. So if Jesus comes across as lenient on kind of divorce, then the question will be, is he really actually holy? And if he says, I'm really strict about divorce itself, then he runs the risk of really challenging, as his crowds are growing around him, challenging the current authority who the last guy did that got beheaded. So you can see how this is a no-win situation. Okay. Secondly, there are 613 laws in the Hebrew Bible. About two, you can 2 plus 1, I'll show you why in a second. It's a 2 and there's like a second clause. So call it 3 if you want, but roughly 2 kind of specifically addressing divorce as divorce. And because there's so little about the very idea of divorce, there's a ton of debate about it. So there's very little to talk about and a ton of debate. So let's kind of pick it back up again. So is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? The Pharisees ask him. Jesus then responds, what did Moses command you? Notice the word command. This is going to matter in a little bit, but what did Moses command you? They say, Moses permitted, not commanded, but Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away. In effect, they've just dodged actually what Jesus is asking. What did Moses command? Well, Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and then send her away. Now, for a lot of us, there's a lot to talk about here, which it's culturally is going to be really tough. But to give you a sense of a little bit of it, the certificate of divorce is actually kind of an innovation in the ancient world, and it is something it's really actually for the protection of the woman in this regard. If she doesn't have a certificate of divorce, she cannot remarry. So this enables both parties to be like, they're not attached to anybody else. That's what that is. Now, despite that, women as clearly are at a profound disadvantage. This is about a man divorcing his wife. Now that's a really interesting thing because it's, again, it's only about the man in this particular instance, at least up to this point. Now, the certificate of divorce, as sort of described here, is mentioned in a particular part of the Bible. Again, this is one of those passages about divorce, and it's a 4-verse run-on sentence. I'm only going to show you the first sentence of this particular passage, but you get the idea where this is coming from and the controversial elements of it. So here we go. Deuteronomy 24 says this: Deuteronomy 24, verse 1, if a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and gives it to her and sends her from his house, and then so on, you get the rest of the run-on sentence that goes on there. A couple things to kind of consider. First, the phrase becomes displeasing is part of the issue, but the real issue is about the phrase something indecent. Because what exactly does that mean? If the wife of a man, does something that is indecent, well, what exactly does that sort of mean? Now, there's two big schools of thought at the time of Jesus, two Jewish schools of thought that are the most dominant. One is led by a guy named Rabbi Hillel, and the other is by a guy named Shammai. And what Hillel says is, look, something indecent is any reason that the man comes up with. Like whatever it is, burns the food, I don't like whatever, I like someone else. It's like, it doesn't matter. It's just, that is something indecent. The other guy, Shammai, says, look, there's only one reason, and it's only for adultery. That's the only reason why this works. So again, Hillel's like, look, something indecent means anything unpleasant. And Shammai is like, anytime the only reason is for unfaithfulness. Now, the people who are asking Jesus the question about divorce are very aware of these two schools of thought. And Jesus sides with neither of them for this particular reason, that they're missing the point. The question itself, their answer itself, misses the point. So remember, they're asking the question, look, what does Moses command? Well, he gives us permission to give a certificate of divorce and send her away. And Jesus says, well, that's only because your hearts were hard that Moses wrote this law. Jesus replied, it's only because your hearts were hard, which means divorce is a concession to human beings. It's not part of the plan. I mean, it's not part of the original design. The way that things were intended and the way that things are, this isn't the way God necessarily intended it. Jesus asked, what did Moses command? Well, he lets us, really, they're like, Moses permits us to write a certificate of divorce, and that's all it takes. And this is a radical interpretation, what Jesus is challenging here. Because what he's saying, and notice this is really radical, because the Bible permits something, it is not the same thing as God's will or God's command. Because the Bible permits it doesn't mean it's necessarily God's will. I'll give you a couple examples. I know that's a big one for you. So the Bible has a couple different examples of this that, aren't related to this necessarily. One is the idea of polygamy. You know that there's multiple people in the Bible who have multiple wives. That's never the prescribed thing. The Bible does deal with people who have multiple wives, but God does deal with those people, but it's not a prescribed path for them. Same with slavery. Slavery is not prescribed. It's not what God intends. People still have slaves. That's really controversial. The idea itself, even of the idea of kings, the people want a king. God's like, I'm going to be your king. And they're like, no, we want a king. You can read about this in 1 Samuel. We want a king. It's in 1 Samuel 8. We want a king. And God's like, you know what a king will do? He'll send your sons to war and he'll take your daughters for his own household. That's what's going to happen. They're like, we want a king. God's like, okay, you can have a king. Permitted it. In 2 Samuel, one king named David is like, you know what? I just feel pretty terrible. I've got this awesome palace. I should build God a temple. He needs a temple. And, God's like, I don't need a temple. I like the tent. They had a mobile worship center, big tent. God's an REI guy. He's an outdoorsy type. He likes it. He's like, I don't need it. In fact, he even says, when did I ever ask you to build me a temple? And David's like, I want to build you a temple. And he's like, okay, well, so his son Solomon actually ends up building the temple, and God's like, I'll dwell in there, but that's not what I'm asking of you. Some things that are permitted aren't necessarily God's direct will. And here Jesus is talking, he's addressing that very idea. Divorce is a concession to the condition of human beings, but it's not part of the original design. And Jesus seems to be saying, to a certain extent, this is my own interpretation here, Jesus seems to be saying, by their answer, what you guys are kind of hinting at is that you've made divorce almost the point of marriage, which loses the entire focus. So Jesus brings it back to the original image, all the way back, even before kind of these commands that are kind of talked about in Deuteronomy. He gets all the way back to the very beginning of what God intended. So I'm going to read you, it's a long passage here, but just stay with me. Here's what it is in Matthew chapter 10, verse 6. He's quoting from the book of Genesis here. He says, but at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. And for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united, notice the language, to his wife. And the two will become one flesh. So they're no longer two, but one flesh. And therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. Then he continues. When they were in the house again, so the disciples are asking a question here because they don't understand, right? So the disciples hear Jesus say this. They're like, we're going to need some clarification because how did you challenge those guys on that idea? They asked Jesus again. Jesus gives them a pretty direct and pretty tough answer. He says this. He answered, anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her, which is an interesting way of framing that. He's actually kind of saying that the recipient of the issue here is the divorced person, not the person who wants the divorce. Interesting language here. But again, we don't have enough time to talk too much about that. Here we go. Then verse 12. And if she divorces her husband and marries another man, she commits adultery. Now, man, a lot there. So much to kind of consider about this. Jesus will say, this is, by the way, this is not the exhaustive sort of, I don't know what you call it, like the exhaustive talk about this particular subject. It needs a lot more nuance and a lot more subtlety and a lot more detail. And there are other parts of the Bible that do address it. But in this particular instance, Jesus is like, yeah, there's probably some reasons for divorce, but it's way more than just simply not feeling it. As he's challenging these Pharisees who are like, we can just write a certificate and it's all done. We can just write a little scroll and it's all over. Jesus is like, no, it's not that at all. Just because you don't feel like being married anymore, it's not a good reason. The Bible is operating typically on something called a covenant. Now, whenever people enter an agreement, more like a sacred agreement is called a covenant. And that's in contrast to what you and I might know as a contract. So the covenant is always kind of held up against a contract. They're very similar in that this is how two parties are bound together, but a covenant has this statement kind of built into it. Even if, and I'm oversimplifying here, even if, that's a covenant. And a contract has then this statement, as long as. So to kind of give you an example then, a contract then says, as long as you're doing what you're supposed to do and I do what I'm supposed to do, the contract is valid. And a covenant says, even if you don't, we're still bound together. Now, there are stipulations for covenants and all that kind of stuff too, but I just want you to get, a covenant is what God has with us. It's what God has with his people. It's as if to say, even if you don't keep up your end of the quote unquote bargain, probably better said, even though you won't hold up your end of the bargain, I still choose you. This is a really fascinating innovation in sort of the world of, the ancient religion, because what it's saying is, well, all of the other gods are like, I abandon the people because I don't really want to, I just barely tolerate them. God's like, I love you and I'm with you and I'm going to be for you, even if and even though you might abandon me. In fact, even today, people are getting baptized this weekend. And a lot of folks, as they get baptized, they're essentially kind of affirming that covenant relationship. I'm letting go of an old life and being raised to a new one, but that old life that I'm leaving behind is because God is entering into a covenant, has entered into a covenant with me that even if he'll still be my God and I'll still belong to him. Does that make sense? Now, when it comes to divorce is a protection for people who are unprotected by their covenant keeper, if that makes sense. When there is abuse or neglect, or a heart so hardened to the other person that this other person has no other alternative, this is where this kind of comes into play. So the idea itself, again, we're talking about a lot of stuff here, but again, the idea here is, as one Bible translator said, this is a person who actually wrote what a lot of the translation we use, she was assistant on it, her name's Janine Brown. She says this way with regard to marriage, fascinating kind of take on it. She says, Jesus called a lifelong marriage is a high expectation. And it is also an implicit affirmation of the worth and importance of women in the kingdom. She is kind of highlighting the idea here that Jesus is saying that the easy discarding of women for being unsatisfactory is just not okay. The Pharisees are asking a question about how do we just do this right? Can we okay? Is it all right if we just do this? What do you say about this? And they're trying to trap him. And Jesus is like, anytime we're just sort of discarding a person, that's just not going to be okay. A wife cannot be discarded. Janine Brett actually points out, and there's one story in the Bible, some of you are familiar with it. Jesus meets a person, a woman, a Samaritan woman at a well. This is a person who's had 5 husbands. And most of the time, and the way that I've taught it before and interpreted this story is that Jesus is identifying these 5 husbands, and he's kind of identifying the fact that she's got a promiscuous past. That's probably the most common way you'll see that taught. And what she asks is that what Janine Brown asks is maybe that's true, but probably what also might be true is that this person is just a woman who has been discarded. Like the husbands are kind of using her until they're all done, and then they're done. She's no longer the kind of person. Maybe she's done something indecent, and it's like whatever that is, that's enough. Jesus seems to be saying repeatedly throughout his ministry, no one gets to be discarded. No one gets to be discarded. And you guys who are asking this question are asking it in the wrong way. And you've totally missed the point, which is the bigger point, is that no one gets to be discarded ever. So what do we do with that? It's a lot to talk about here. And again, this is probably worthy of a whole series. This is just what we got for today. But so bear with me as I try to bring this home a little bit. Not long ago, I was with my sons, and one of my sons, the older one, he asked me, he goes, he says, hey, what surprises most people? This was interesting because he's about to graduate from college. He's like, what surprises most people, like when they get married? And I said, well, there's a lot of things that sort of surprise people when they get married. I said mainly the first thing happens is that the guys kind of discover how much more often they're going to be clothed than they realize. Everybody, we're not always consummating our marriage all the time, which is a little bit surprising for a lot of guys. But the other thing that's surprising is this. I said, people get shocked to discover how selfish they are. Like, it's easy to identify the selfishness of the other person, but it actually becomes incredibly shocking when all of a sudden, all the routines and everything that you and I do on our own, all of a sudden, people get really shocked to discover their own selfishness. In fact, if someone's unable to address or identify their own selfishness at the beginning of their marriage is really in trouble. Here's what Tim Keller says in his book, The Meaning of Marriage. It's a long quote, but here's what he says. He says, sociologists argue that in contemporary Western society, the marketplace has become so dominant that the consumer model increasingly characterizes most relationships that historically were covenantal, remember that language, including marriage. Today, we stay connected to people only as long as they're meeting our particular needs at an acceptable cost to us. When we cease to make a profit, that is, when the relationship appears to require more love and affirmation from us than we're getting back, then we cut our losses and drop the relationship. This has also been called commodification, that is to say, make a thing a commodity, a process by which social relationships are reduced to economic exchange relationships, and so the very idea of covenant is disappearing in our culture. Covenant is therefore a concept increasingly foreign to us, and yet the Bible says it is the essence of marriage. He seems to be pointing out that if we kind of think about marriage as the idea of a way we acquire or use other people until we get everything that we want from them and then we're kind of done with them, we've actually really missed out. We've damaged the whole idea of what marriage is all about. Because the one thing that undoes or undermines what God has intended for anything in human beings is the inability of human beings to resist the gravity of their own self-centeredness. The one thing that undoes what God intended is the inability of when human beings are unable to resist the gravity of their own self-centeredness. That's how all of a sudden all of this marriage stuff and even our pursuit of marriage, whether you're single or or maybe you're separated or you're kind of whatever that situation is, the thing that's often in the way is our own selfishness. Not always, for sure, but that's often what's in the way. Keller continues. He says, look, Destructive to marriage is the self-fulfillment ethic that assumes marriage and family are the primary institutions of personal fulfillment, necessary for us to become whole and happy. The assumption that there is someone just right for us to marry and that if we look closely enough, we'll find the right person. But that's the assumption, right? We'll find our soulmate. It's an illusion that if we find our one true soulmate, everything wrong with us will be healed. But that makes the lover, the soulmate person, into God. And no human being can live up to that. We live in a world where it just seems to say, look, we're looking for a way to figure out how is it that we're able to find our soulmate so that we will be whole people. And the Bible does not give to us the idea that, listen, you're not a complete person until you find another person. That's not what the Bible tells us. Jesus was never married. The Apostle Paul was never married. And both of those people who are instrumental in sort of forming the idea, I mean, obviously Jesus is the reason why we're here, but it seems if our own mythology actually disqualifies Jesus as a whole person. What happens to us is the idea of the soulmate language is just kind of to give a spiritual covering over stuff that we really just want, that we think will make us whole. It's true. And we all kind of fall into that trap. And the result is the result of all of that kind of thinking lends itself to a kind of greater selfishness that's kind of cloaked in sort of spiritual language. What we end up doing is, and again, this is about everything and about every kind of, but just speaking about relationships in particular, and marriage more specifically, we tend to say something like this: because I can't get what I want, or I'm tired of waiting for what it is that I want, I get to get what I'm not getting, so to speak. Because I can't get what I want, or I'm tired of waiting for it, I get to go get what I'm not getting. I get permission to go and get what I'm not getting on my own terms. This is how most people respond to this sort of stuff. Whether it's I get to go end this, I get to start that, I get to try out this, I get to give myself this permission, all of that stuff. I get to get what I'm not getting because I'm not getting it at home. And if you're a person who's like, look, I'm not going to go do that, what we start doing for a lot of us, we'll just lean into something else. Well, then I get to resent them. If I can't go get it, at least I get to resent this person who I'm in this marriage with, or this person I'm not in a marriage with, but want to be. Or another way to say it simply, if I don't get what I want, then I get to act out. I get to go do whatever I want. I get to harden my heart to that person I'm supposed to be with in a particular marriage. I get to harden my heart to this person who I'm with. And maybe I'm not in a relationship, so I just go get to find it however I want, and it doesn't matter what I do. I'm just going to make all kinds of decisions because it's not working out the way it's supposed to work out, so I just go get what I want. And all of us have been down that road in some way or another. Everyone. What I want to do with this time left is we've been kind of putting this emphasis on prayer during the Lent season. Is every one of us has relational impact. We've either walked through a divorce, we've thought about a divorce, we've had someone in our life who has had a divorce who was close to us. We've had our own pursuit of marriages and failed marriages and our own idea of what relationships should look like. And we're starting to wonder for a lot of people who have been kind of swept up in a particular mythology about relationships, there's a part of us that says, I'm not, maybe I got forgotten. And so I'm starting to think about just going to get whatever I want on my own terms. I get it. Every one of us has been in some capacity in that way. So I want to give you some things to think about going into this response moment of as we kind of conclude this message and go into sort of some response and prayer. One is this. Some of you, if you are here with your spouse, and maybe there's a part of you that's like, hey, look, it's been pretty tough. And both of us are looking at each other and kind of going, I think we need a little bit of help here. Well, everybody at some point needs a little help. Sometimes all the way from a refresh to a rehab. Everybody, if you're in any marriage, there's probably some point where you've been in that situation. And maybe part of it is the reaffirmation that you are in a two-way covenant. That even if we're going to be together. Because the only thing that a marriage, apparently, according to research, cannot overcome is a hardened heart. So, okay, we've made some mistakes. Let's reaffirm this covenant. Maybe you come forward as a couple. Our prayer team will pray over you. We'd love to pray with you. To let you know you're not alone. And that God still is with you in this. Secondly, you might be a person who needs to let go of a mythology that you've kind of held on to. And maybe it's kind of guided you into particular places and making some compromises or things you might have, kind of pursued that aren't really lining up. But there's only one person who can give you what your soul needs, and that's not another That's not a spouse. It's Jesus. And maybe there's a part of you that needs to let go of a mythology, a magical thinking about a soulmate. Maybe there's some of us in the room, maybe you're a person who just needs to receive God's grace because he's not abandoned you. Maybe you've been through a divorce. Maybe you're in the middle of a divorce. Maybe you're thinking about it. Maybe you're the one who's been left behind and you're feeling somehow a little bit discarded, or in a huge way discarded and no longer needed, disregarded and discarded. And you're like, I'm done with this. I don't know what to do. And maybe there's so much, maybe there's even some shame that's not even yours to bear, but it's upon you and you feel it. And maybe there's some stuff that you're just afraid that if God knew about it, or what, you're just so living in there, holding it all yourself. And maybe the invitation for prayer today to come forward is just to receive some of God's grace, which is abundant. It's abundant. He's not abandoned you at all. And maybe you're a person who just doesn't know. You're in a relationship situation that is really tough and you need to seek God's guidance. And maybe it's all these things. But this time of responding, where we've just seen people coming forward over the past couple of weeks to kind of walk into this relationship with Jesus in a new and a fresh way, maybe this is that moment for you now. So, however it is that you might experience the idea of this particular story, this encounter, the emotional sort of ping that's in it, and also some of the implications, might you hear clearly that no one gets to be discarded ever. That's the point of what Jesus is saying. So we're going to go to prayer with that. Would you pray with me? Jesus, we have so many stories of our own life that is operating on the fear of or the reality of the experience of being discarded. It's surprising that the religious leaders Jesus is dealing with don't even seem to see that. And Jesus says, this isn't about divorce. This is about marriage. It's about people. It's about human beings. So Jesus, would you move in us in this particular space? Would you soften our hearts, knowing that there's no marriage that can survive a hardened heart, and that our own allegiance to a particular mythology about the future, we might be hardened to you. Maybe our trust has run out for you. Might restore through your grace and your goodness, and your faith, in our own faith in you, your presence of your Spirit in us, Father. Would you soften our hearts once again to you? And so, Jesus, we give to you this time to respond in your name. Amen.